Now a little pop-up might have come on your screen just to say that you're okay with the recording. Okay, lovely. So what I would like to invite you to do is, just so that everybody then has met one another in the group, can I invite each of you then to introduce yourselves? And again, it's by invitation, if you would like to share what you've just reflected on in terms of what you want to get from today, or what your question might be, then please do feel free to share. But as I said, it's invitation. You don't have to share what you've just reflected on. Okay. And I'll leave it open to the group, whoever wants to go first.
Oh, shall I jump in? I don't know.
Thanks, Emily.
Hi everyone. I'm Emily. So I'm just beginning my journey as a supervisor. I've trained, but I'm not practicing at the moment. So I think really what I'd like to get from today is just a sense of increased confidence in being able to start working with, I'm going to be working with supervisors in private practice who will be with counsellors, in private practice, who will be working themselves with a diverse range of individuals. And I want to feel like I can best support their practice as well as my own, to be honest.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Emily. Welcome to the space.
Thank you.
Who would like to go next?
I can go next. Hi, everyone. My name's Iman. I've been a supervisor for the last couple of months in a young person's mental health charity. For the therapies team, I think I felt overwhelmed at the beginning. And I think it just was like I was jumped it straight in, and I think I guess what I'd like to get out of today is how to support anti-oppressive practice in my supervisors and myself, and I guess like just even learning more about what it looks like. I think I would benefit a lot from that.
Lovely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Emma. Welcome to the space.
Thank you.
I'd like to be going next. That's
helpful. Thank you, Cheryl. Yeah, please.
My name's Cheryl, and I've been qualified as a supervisor for about 3 years, and I think that this question is perhaps beyond the scope of this group, but it's the only thing that my mind's got stuck on for some reason. I experience a lot of frustration when my supervisees tell me that their tutors are not kind of addressing diversity in a constructive way. So I don't know whether I need to vent or have ideas, or maybe just share any experiences that others have around that, and maybe it's over optimistic to think that I can do anything about that, but I wanted to mention it.
Yeah. Thank you, Cheryl. It's you say it's bigger than this, but actually I think we are going to look at I think we'll get somewhere. I'm optimistic that we will at least start to recognize how us in our role of supervisors can support our supervisees thinking about it. I think you're quite right in the sense of we don't become the person to go, right, well, I'll teach you everything, because that's not our role. But actually, as supervisors, what we'll hopefully discover today is that we do have a role within that, within the development and growth of thinking about diversity with our supervisees. So yeah, we'll do our best. Thank you, Cheryl. Who would like to go next? Myira, please.
Good morning, everybody. Greetings from Isle of Man.
Lovely.
What I would like, I mean, I have a limited experience, about 1 year as a supervisor. What I would like today to learn is really, and to apply to my own practice, what hinders my to be attuned, cultural attunement with my supervisee. That is something I would like to learn and to apply to self after. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. You mentioned a key concept there, Myira, cultural attunement, key aspect of anti-oppressive practice. So yes, we will be thinking about that today. Yes, lovely. Thank you, Myira.
Hello.
Last but not least.
Last but not least, yes. Emma, from Devon. I'm in Devon. I've been a supervisor for quite a while now, and I'm specialising now in internal family systems therapy supervision.
Yes.
And I've edited a book on it, the first book on it. Maybe not the last, but hopefully, well, you know. So yes, I want to understand the concept more and reflect on my system in relation to the concept. And I'm aware that there are some supervisory relationships I'm in as supervisor when I actually have parts that feel a bit oppressed themselves. So that's kind of curious to me. And I often don't quite know how to respond to that. So, and I you know, I can relate to the concept of there's not much CPD for supervisors. So it's great. I'm really glad to be here and learning more about your models.
Great. Well, welcome. Well, thank you, everybody. I think between all of you, I feel like you've all touched on aspects that we're going to be looking at today. So hopefully by the end of this day, as I said, I'm optimistic that by the end of the day, we will have explored and discovered what anti-oppressive supervision is. But for me, it's also about ensuring that all of you then are taking away something fairly concrete in terms of, right, this is going to support me perhaps in thinking differently, applying something to my supervision practice, or offering me tools to help me think about supervision in new or additional ways. Okay, so as I said, I'm quite excited because I think all of you have kind of, as I said, Nate touched upon things that go, oh yes, we'll be thinking about this together. Okay, yeah. So oh, I've still got an itchy nose this morning. I think it's like weirdly a bit of hay fever, but also change in temperature where we're at. All of a sudden it's got very cold, so like my nose is itching away. Okay, so in terms of then the structure of the day and how we're going to work through thinking about anti-oppressive supervision is, if you're anything like me with my both telescopic and microscopic brain, what I like to do is go into slightly telescope mode, which is let me get a sense of the bigger picture first before I then go into microscope and then really get into the granular of the detail of what it is. So where we're going to start, in order to think about anti-oppressive supervision, we need to first of all understand what is kind of the bigger framework of anti-oppressive practice, okay? Because a lot of the concepts and a lot of what we think about in anti-oppressive supervision is like fundamental and foundational to thinking about anti-oppressive, the context and the framework of anti-oppressive practice, kind of full stop in a way. So as I said, in order for us to understand what it looks like in supervision, we need to understand what anti-oppressive practice is anyway. So we're going to walk through and discover what the pieces are, the concepts that make up anti-oppressive practice, and then apply that then to the working within diversity framework, which we will then apply to supervision. Okay, so in this first morning session, we're going to be looking at that broader scope, first of all, in order to give us context of actually what anti-oppressive processes and practices are, so that we can then, when we apply them to the supervision model later in the day, we already are aware of what they are and how we understand them. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So yes, it probably is this strange thing of, we're not starting off thinking about supervision. We're going to start off thinking about the anti-oppressive part first, and then we're going to add it, and then we're going to apply it to supervision. Okay. As I said, we're going to be working through the slide deck, but of course, if at any point, I want this to be really interactive. So if at any point you have a question, or you have a thought, I'll offer space and I'll bring us back into gallery anyway throughout it. But of course, if you have a question as I'm presenting a particular slide, please do feel free to unmute or shout out that you want to ask a question. Okay. So any questions though before we start and jump into the material at all? No, everyone good to go? Lovely. Okay. So just bringing up the screen share. There we go. So she says. There we go. So I was trying to move the slide. So as I've mentioned, that in the background, or kind of, I talk about my workings out, my thinking behind something. So you'll hear me say this throughout the day, my workings out. For me, in order to make an intentional, conscious move into saying that I'm going to be offering anti-oppressive practice, I have to recognise that what I'm actually doing is that I'm pivoting, or I'm moving from a position of oppressive to anti-oppressive. Okay, I hold the opinion that unless we are being intentional that what we're offering is anti-oppressive, what we are unconsciously, maybe unintentionally, but where we find ourselves is in a default position of oppressive practice. Okay. And I'll talk you through as I said, my workings out and why I think current practice is oppressive if we are not being intentional that it's anti-oppressive. I believe that we are in a default position within the profession that a lot of our practice is oppressive because we're not acknowledging what oppression actually is. I think we hide from the fact that we can be oppressive in our work, and we work within systems that are oppressive. So for me, it's really calling out that unless we are making an intentional, deliberate, conscious decision to work in an anti-oppressive manner, we are by default working from an oppressive position. And this is the starting point for me of moving from working with diversity to working within diversity, by making that shift from working with difference and or diversity, as so is so often commonly the phrase in our trainings, and moving to working within. We are making this fundamental shift from oppressive to anti-oppressive practice. So this really is my starting point today. I'm saying it probably sounds quite strong and intense, but for me, we have to recognise that if we are to take up and say that I'm working as an anti-oppressive practitioner, we have to be able to, first of all, deconstruct and dismantle previous practices that we may have been taught. So if any of you have read the book, or been on previous trainings with me, the next few slides are going to be familiar to you. But I think, again, for any training that I do, this sets the foundation for anything that we're going to be speaking about for the rest of the day. Okay. So what do we first of all mean by oppressive practice? We have to understand what that actually means in order to be anti it. Okay. So the definition that I hold of what oppression means is the systematic targeting or marginalisation of one social group by another social group for the benefit of the more powerful social group. That is a definition that I have identified based on a lot of, obviously, the research and reading that I've been doing about this. But by saying that a group is oppressing another, and by doing that, when we are then working from an oppressive position, as I said, unintentionally, what we are doing if one group is targeting and marginalising, what we are then doing in our practice is that we are then ignoring, denying, and removing any acknowledgement of that structural and systemic inequality. That when oppression is happening, it is the power and the oppression over one group by another group. And if we are to ignore that oppression occurs because we live in a world that is made up of structural and systemic inequality, if we ignore that it happens out there in the world, what we then do is we then ignore it and deny it in the in-here space between counsellor and client, or supervisor and supervisee. What I often talk about is that I think in our training, we are trained in a way, traditionally, I would say, we are trained in a way in which we kind of imagine that counselling exists in a vacuum. It exists in a bubble separate from the rest of the world. as if somehow we can create a space that isn't infected by the out there badness, that it is not infected by all the oppression and all of the prejudices and biases that happen out there in the world. And yet, of course, what we recognise, though, is that our profession as a whole, and therefore our practice within the profession, the training within our profession, does exist out there in the world. It is born out from the world, but also it exists within the world. And so if any oppression can occur out there, it can simultaneously exist in the in here space as well. And for me, this is recognizing then that oppression occurs then in here. Because if we are, again, unintentionally, unconsciously, just unaware, if that's a huge blind spot for us, that we can oppress somebody in our relationships, that we are then ultimately ignoring that we can hold power over somebody, but also it also ignores and denies that the person that we are in relationship with, whether that be a client as a counsellor or as a supervisee as the supervisor, that the client coming into a therapeutic relationship or a supervisee coming into a supervision relationship, they are equally bringing into the space their experiences of either oppressing people and or being the oppressed. So if we don't recognize that oppression exists in the world, and that then therefore then it can be recreated and repeated and reinforced in the in here space, if we ignore all of that, guess what we're doing? We're actually automatically by default setting up an oppressive space. So there is a real irony, it's a really sad irony actually, that when our own profession and as I said, in traditional training within our profession, when it doesn't acknowledge that we live in an oppressed society in which power oppression dynamics exist, we are then unintentionally repeating it, reinforcing it. We are just reenacting, that's what I've been thinking of, reenacting it in our in here relationships. And of course, that happens both in the therapeutic relationship and also in the supervision relationship as well. So everything that I'm really going to be, and we're going to be thinking about today, is applicable both in therapeutic relationships and supervision relationships. Okay, so this is where I believe kind of where the starting point needs to be for today. What I'll do is, again, I'm going to every so often just stop sharing and come back to the gallery, to the view of everyone. Just want to check in. Any thoughts or reflections on where we've started?
It's so helpful to me that you articulated this idea of why this might be a blind spot in the profession. So the idea of it being the sacrosanct, special, unique place, because I've been wondering why it can be such a blind spot in the profession, and you've given me a really helpful way of kind of understanding that.
Yes. And I think that's just reinforced through the training. I think it's reinforced through the fantasy of what work, the fantasy of both the role of counsellor and the fantasy of the counselling space. And of course, anything that gets applied to counselling equally gets applied to supervision as well. So anytime I mention counselling, I'm by default including supervision in that as well. But absolutely, there is a fantasy that somehow we are able to carve out the sacrosanct space, as you've described it, Cheryl, absolutely, that somehow is untouched by the rest of the world. And somehow the moment we exist in that space, us as people, us in our own humanity, us in our own lived experiences and in our identity, somehow all get left outside of that space. And I think it's reinforced by the classic cliche of counsellors being blank slates. Thank you. Say blank spaces. I can't get my words out today, so I apologise. Blank slates, but it's exactly that. This idea that if it's this idea of it being a vacuum means that it's it's like a sterile environment, both the space itself, but also who we are in that space as well. So we become these blank slates. But of course, we know that's not true. So the moment we can now show up in our spaces as the people that we are, in the full identities that we are, guess what? We then allow for the out there world to get in. It allows for the in here. It actually, in kind of metaphorically in my head, I visually go, it allows the space to actually grow bigger and allow all of that out there to come into the in here space. We can start to acknowledge what is happening out there in here, and also how it can get repeated in here as well. Yeah. But I think you've really kind of pinpointed that, Cheryl, that this is what's perpetuating the idea that counselling is this sacrosanct space, separate, and therefore, and it's why then by default then it becomes an oppressive space.
And it gives me a bit more empathy towards the tutors and institutions who I was railing about, because I can kind of see, why that happens.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Cheryl. Yes. Anybody else? Emily?
Yeah, I was just going to say that actually I'm sitting with like a real sense of comfort hearing it spoken and acknowledged, and hearing that, you know, that bringing of our wider world into the counselling space, and hearing how you've kind of reflected it in that way. I felt more relaxed in a strange way, just hearing it acknowledged and spoken. It's so nice to think, yeah, you know, stop with the blank slates, you know. Yeah. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. I wasn't expecting to sit with such a sense of comfort from that.
Yes, there is and I can really resonate with that comfort, because for me then I get to relax into being me in my therapeutic and supervision relationships, rather than this need to be performative, or this need to almost be this kind of false self of I'm a counsellor or I'm a supervisor. And I've never really adjusted to being that anyway. There's something about it. It's me that my supervisees and my clients are in relationship with, and I cannot be a blank slate. I mean, physically, visually, none of us can be blank slates. So the idea that somehow we can be immune to the out there world dynamics and create something, as I said, that feels very sterile in here, then what we are actually doing is a disservice to our clients and supervisees then, because what we're then doing is we're saying that we're going to remove the out there world from your narrative, from your lived experiences. And so your lived experience then becomes a vacuum. And actually what we're doing, we're putting all of those contexts back in. But yeah, I can really resonate with that, Emily, the idea of, I can just relax now and go, yeah, that whole big wide world out there, bring it in. Rather than the other way around, which is let's try and shut it out. I'm now like going, no, let's welcome it in. Yeah.
And
yeah. Emma, please.
Yes, bring it in, and the intentionality of bringing it in and reflecting on it, so that there's a chance it's not the same as out there. So that if it is oppressive out there, let's try and do something different in here.
Yes.
And I think that's something that's missed as well. Yes. You know, there's this kind of blank screen, or, you know, we're real people. Yeah, we're real people, but I'm hoping my relationship with people as a supervisor or as a therapist has more intentionality behind it, and more choices around how I exist with them and what I bring in and speak for or don't speak for. Or so I really like the intentionality emphasis.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And again, just picking up on what you said, Emma, thank you for sharing that, because there's something about not only then in anti-oppressive practice, whether in counselling or supervision, can we offer something different, but also we offer the opportunity for that client or supervisee to actually be able to name it as oppression. How often do clients or supervisees, and I'm sure most of you or all of you will be able to identify at least a client in mind that thinks that what they're experiencing is because of them, as opposed to actually you're on the receiving end of an oppressive society. You're experiencing that because of your identity, not because you are experiencing it because you personally are doing something to cause that. Does that make sense? Like, there's something about, we can take our clients' now lived experiences and go, well, maybe that's because there is prejudice against you. Maybe that's because that you are part of, you represent or are a member of a particular minoritized or marginalized community. And so you experience those barriers, you are experiencing those prejudices and those hurdles to succeed, or you're experiencing bullying, for example, at work. So it's starting to recognize that their lived experience was within that external context. So picking upon, Emma, what you're saying, yes, we can offer something that puts their lived experience within that external context, and also offers something in the space then that doesn't recreate it in here. Yeah, it's so powerful. Yeah. Anybody else want to share? Myira, please.
Yeah, it's you're absolutely right. I relate to this. It's so powerful what you're saying. And for me, though, Myra, what will be is, first of all, to apply all this to myself.
Yes.
Before I can actually go out there and work with my client. So everything I'm learning today, I'm going to reflect on it and apply to myself. And yeah, hopefully that will give me some, well, it's giving me already a new insight, and sort of to revisit my whole practice really for the past whatever years I've been practicing. Yeah. It's just, yeah, no, thank you for this. Yeah.
Yeah. It's for me, it's that it's just that moment, that penny dropping moment, and then you go, oh, it's this.
Yeah.
And I can kind of see it, Myira, for you. It's like, oh,
yeah,
this is the shift. This is the difference.
Absolutely.
Because you're quite right that the moment we acknowledge what it is that we're doing, it changes our entire practice. Because it's fundamental to what we do in the room. Yeah. So it's not about criticizing. This is a real opportunity for all of us to offer some self-compassion to how we have been working, perhaps, and to recognize that actually I've been working in a way because that's how I've been trained to do it, and how I've been supervised to do it, and how I've been encouraged through our training to do it. This is what we've been trained to do. And I think throughout today, then, please absolutely offer yourself the self-compassion to go, what I'm learning today then is going to and will change how I work, but don't take away the work, the amazing work you all would have already have done. It's, as I said, it's pivoting. So it's not throwing out what you did before, it's pivoting so that you're still using all the same skills, you're still being yourselves in relationship, but by pivoting, what you get to do then is offer a new way, a new lens in which to engage with our clients and supervisees. So
yeah, as I said, Myra, is just revisiting rather all my experience, revisiting and sort of take what I take away.
Yes.
Today, from today, basically. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, we have to, if we're going to pivot and if we are going to do something different in our work, in order to do something differently, we have to deconstruct what we've already been doing in order to reconstruct it in a newer, healthier way. And so that's why I always talk through in my trainings through this process of let's deconstruct oppressive practice in order to reconstruct it as anti-oppressive. Yeah. It's not just adding something to what we already do. It's literally taking out brick by brick what we have been doing and then rebuilding with new bricks. Yeah. And that's what we'll do today. Yeah. Anybody else want to share?
Yeah, I will.
Yeah,
so I echo what everyone has said so far. And I'm recognizing, I guess, like aspects of myself and the work and the organization and everything in what you've said so far. I guess what's coming up for me is, so I feel like a weight as well as like relief, because when I stepped into the role, the organization I worked for was kind of being under scrutiny for discrimination and oppressive practice. And so there was something about stepping into this role and like, I guess what I represented that made me feel pressurized to do the work for the whole team. And so, and even things like introducing reflective practice on like different elements of kind of diversity and what we can think about. But then also this other part of me that's like, no, but I also need to be doing the work myself. So yeah, that's what I've been sort of battling with. And I think it's just like bringing it to the forefront of the word oppression, and then kind of like trying to think about how to deconstruct and reconstruct into anti-oppressive practice that feels quite, I don't know, like, you know, when something's a blur and it hasn't quite come into focus, a bit like that.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it will come into focus throughout the day. Yes. Those of you that are familiar with my trainings or know me, I'm very visual in my thinking and learning, but also and in my teaching. And I use a lot of metaphor. And the metaphor that has just come into the visual metaphor that's just come into my mind is one of a cake. Now, what I mean by that is when we make up, or when we bake a cake, I should say, when we are at that process of folding in all of the ingredients, you can't then remove an ingredient. So it's not like you've made up the batter and gone, right, well, let me now take out the eggs, for example. And I think with oppressive practice, it's recognizing that oppressive practice is either the batter that's about to be baked or equally the cake we've just taken out of the oven. To go from oppressive practice to anti-oppressive practice, we cannot simply just take out the eggs. What we have to do is get a whole new recipe and recognize what are the ingredients of oppressive practice, what do we no longer need in this recipe, and how do we now create a new recipe, and with the ingredients that are actually going to end up when we mix them together is going to bake me an anti-oppressive cake. Because I think the challenge that I'm hearing, Iman, in the role that you have and the weight that you're talking about is an expectation perhaps that we want to go from an anti-oppressive cake to from an oppressive cake to an anti-oppressive one, but can you do that by removing the eggs? And that it's just not possible. It's not as simple as just changing an ingredient after it's all been blended together. And this is what I mean about we have to actually deconstruct something in order to reconstruct it as anti-oppressive. Because the very nature of oppressive practice means that it's already blended into the actual infrastructure of what we're doing. And so that's what I'm saying about this pivot. It isn't just a matter of do this one thing differently. Otherwise, this would be an hour's webinar, and I will give you the one thing that you all now need to do differently, and off you trot. And it doesn't work like that, because what we are fundamentally sitting on, as was kind of said in that slide, is we're actually sitting on a foundation that is already made up of oppressive practice. And we have to change that. Yeah. So it really is this pivot from this, go with it, this cake of oppressive practice and going, right, we're throwing out the cake, we're kind of throwing out, we're going to deconstruct that recipe, we're going to throw out that recipe, because actually what we need are different ingredients, new ingredients, and then it creates something that actually looks very different. Yeah. So yeah, if the metaphor helps you, then great. If it doesn't,
it's like you want to make a vegan cake.
you
know, rather than a regular cake, you've
yes.
realised that you want to make a
yes.
vegan cake, something like that.
Yes. And so, yeah, and all the ingredients have to change. It's not just a matter of, right, taking out the butter and the eggs. It's about actually the whole recipe looks different. As a vegan, I know it looks completely different. Yes. Yeah.
Can I just say,
Emma wanted, Emma, please.
I love, my system just goes to food metaphors so
good.
often.
Oh, I'm not on my own then.
So can I use your cake metaphor outside
Absolutely.
of here?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, you will hear me come up with random metaphors throughout the day, so please be ready for that. I am incredibly visual in my thinking. So yeah, that's what we're doing. We're coming up with, you know, exactly that. Anti-oppressive practices is a whole new cake, whole new recipe, whole new ingredients. And so ultimately then what we want to be doing as supervisors is offering something new. It's again in that intentional piece, Emma, that you've picked up on. We are intentionally making a decision to offer something new, not just tweaking an old recipe. Yeah. Yeah. Myira, did you want to? I think a couple of you spoke at the same time. So Myira, did you want to say something? You didn't have to, but just
No.
Okay.
I'm just surprised, really, if you offered me this opportunity, that, and I'm grateful to you for doing this work, though, that we have not acknowledged this before. Well, it's been happening. Yeah.
It's been happening since Freud's day. It's like,
absolutely, yes, yeah. Yeah,
it has. Yeah. It's entrenched, and I think that's the thing with when it's the very thing that's about structural and systemic oppression and inequality. Guess what? It's going to be embedded structurally within our profession, because that's what the profession is built on. Again, it's not separate from it. So yeah, our very trainings, our very profession and our professional practice and field is built on systemic oppression. Yeah. Okay. So what I'm going to walk us through then is, we've kind of really acknowledged that the starting point is this. We currently have this cake of oppression or oppressive practice. So what we're going to do is we're going to deconstruct it a little bit further, and then move into how do we reconstruct it as an anti-oppressive cake. Let's go with that. Let's go with cake to the day. We'll all be craving, maybe we'll be craving cake by the time we get to the end of the day. So we're going to be, as I mentioned, so what we're going to be doing is taking this starting point, and we are going to be deconstructing then why it's oppressive, in order for us then to move into anti-oppressive. Okay, so I've already alluded to it, but in order to understand that it is systemic oppression, what ultimately we're really talking about is that there is this spectrum or system of oppression that is the very foundation of society. That society is built upon structural and systemic inequality. And what oppression does is, because it marginalizes one group over another, what ends up happening on this spectrum is people, communities, groups, certain identities of communities get what I call socially located at one end of this spectrum. We either end up at the power end of the spectrum or at the powerless end of this oppressive relational spectrum, based on a particular aspect of our identity. Now, that can be an identity individual to us. I'll give an example in a moment. It can either be because of who I am individually, or it could be because I represent a particular identity community. So, for example, I will be socially located at the powerless end of this spectrum, because I'm visibly part of a number of minoritized communities. I'm minoritized through being visibly brown, female, Muslim. Okay, those are three very visible aspects of my identity, and each of those identity communities that I belong to, being a female, being brown, and being Muslim, are all minoritized identities within society, because there is its equivalent at the other end of the spectrum. So being female means that male identity ends up at the power end of the spectrum. In being brown, means then that whiteness gets located at the power end of the spectrum. Being Muslim gets of a visible faith gets located at the powerless end of the spectrum. And again, depending where you are in the world, but in majority dominant, again, Western countries, it's being Christian or atheist or agnostic. So again, there's something around we will all hold aspects of our identity that will land us at the powerless end of the spectrum. However, we also power identity characteristics as well. And I think this is really important point to hold on to here, that for every single one of us in our intersectional identity, we hold simultaneously both powerful and powerless aspects of identity. Nobody is either one or the other. It's not binary, okay? We hold multiple identities, and we'll be looking at an identity wheel tool later in the day to give us a bit more in detail on that. But for all of us in our identity, we will land one end or other of the spectrum, depending which of our identity characteristics is dominant in that moment. I can give so an example might be that when I go out into the world, if nobody knows me personally out there in the world and people only see me visibly, then immediately I hold three very visible, as I've mentioned, powerless, minoritized, marginalized aspects of identity. So I get treated generally when I'm out and about in the world as somebody who is marginalized and minoritized. So because of that, I experience a lot of barriers to succeed in life. I am othered, I am treated as less than, and I am not afforded the opportunities and autonomy that other people might have if they hold very visible power aspects of their identity. Examples might be such as when I'm out and about in the world, I'm what's going to be thought of me will be somebody who perhaps is not as educated as I am, somebody who is not as successful kind of work-wise as I am, somebody perhaps who I will be seen as not having as much credibility as somebody that holds power identities. And I then will not then be offered the opportunities for perhaps promotion or opportunities to be involved in different projects or different opportunities that other people might do. So what I experience are a lot of barriers. I'm not automatically given benefits. I'm not automatically given what might be called advantages or privileges because of those aspects of my identity. And it would be really easier for me to go, oh, well, I'm a very oppressed person in the world. But of course, I've also have to be able to be honest with myself and say, simultaneously, though, I hold certain privileged identities at the same time. As somebody who is educated, as somebody who is experienced now as a counsellor and a supervisor and a tutor, as somebody who now has written a book, all of those things afford me credibility, and they afford me opportunities that I would not have had if I did not have those things. Yeah. So I have to recognise that I simultaneously hold oppressed experiences and barriers because of some aspects of my identity, while simultaneously going, but actually, because I'm a counsellor, because I have titles, because I have qualifications, I know that my accent holds a lot of power. Because I have an English accent, it opens doors for me. And I have to be able to be honest with myself and acknowledge that opens doors. It literally gives me opportunities then to be on platforms or to speak. Whereas perhaps if I came with a regional accent or a non-English or non-English as first language speaker, I would not be afforded those same platforms. If I had a very strong accent from South Asian community, I would automatically be perceived as less educated, because I wouldn't be perceived as the eloquent person that I am. So you can start to see how I hold some power, some privilege and advantage in some aspects of my identity. So this is really to acknowledge that for each and every one of us, for different aspects of our identities, we are going to be either pushed down into this powerless position or pushed up into a power position. Okay. And we can, as I said, this identity wheel tool that I'll be introducing to you later, you will then be able to, for each of you, be able to use that as a tool to be able to identify where you hold power or powerlessness in your identity. Okay, so this is really the basis of understanding what oppressive practice is built upon, because ultimately, because what we're saying is that there is inequality, and this is how inequality exists and how it gets perpetrated, how it gets reinforced. Okay, so to continue in deconstructing oppression, what we're going to do is specifically then look at the flip side, which is what is anti-oppressive practice, and then specifically how we move from working with diversity to working within, because as I said, that is kind of the foundation of the model which we will look at for anti-oppressive supervision. Okay, so bear in mind then that this is the basis of how oppression gets reinforced. But also, because it gets reinforced, it also does not get acknowledged, okay? It just exists and we live within it. So on the flip side, what anti-oppressive practice does intentionally, consciously, and in a way systematically is that when we are then saying that we are taking up a position of anti-oppressive practice, the very first thing we have to do is acknowledge that there is structural and systemic inequalities, that system of oppression exists, and that in our relationships there is always a power dynamic being played out in all relationships. That is the intentional starting point with anti-oppressive practice. It kind of says what it kind of does, what it says on the tin. In order to be anti-oppressive, we have to acknowledge that oppression exists. And I think Myira, it was you that said earlier in your reflection that, but it's never been acknowledged before, which is, it is remarkable. But this is kind of the penny dropping moment where we go, of course. So the very first thing we have to do with anti-oppressive practice then is to acknowledge that we live in a world that's oppressive, and it's oppressive because society is constructed on this oppressive spectrum. And so we all experience structural and systemic inequalities, and we experience inequalities at both ends of the spectrum. It's not that if we hold power, we don't experience inequality. We experience inequality because we have the advantage. We equally experience inequality because we hold the disadvantage. No one is immune from it. We all live on this spectrum. And so, as I said, in our relationships then, because we exist within this spectrum of oppression, that relational dynamic, that power relational dynamic is always within our relationships. We also then, by taking up this position of anti-oppressive practice, we have to then support an understanding that each and every person, each and every one of us then, is then shaped by our lived experiences, and that our lived experiences happen within this systemic and structural context. And our lived experiences are because we end up at one end of this power dynamic. Our lived experiences are born out of because we are oppressed, marginalised, minoritised, or our lived experiences are because we hold a position of power and privilege. Like, none of our lived experiences are neutral. None of our lived experiences are, again, in this vacuum, in this sanctuary of neutrality, separate from the rest of the world. Our very existence, our very lived experiences, our narratives, the experiences we've had, who we are in the world, how we experience the world, how the world experiences us and relates back to us, all takes place within this systemic and structural context. And so, of course, this is what I mean by, if it's happening out there, then of course it happens in the in here space as well. And so what we are ultimately trying to do in our therapeutic and supervision relationships then is to offer a relational dynamic of equality. And I name this as flattening the power oppression hierarchy. This is not to say that we get rid of our power, we can't get rid of our power. But what we can absolutely do is flatten it so that we offer something that is not oppressive in our relationships, but we also open up the space to then talk about our experiences of power and oppression, whether that's being the oppressor or the oppressed. So it's both offering a space to talk about it in here and offer a new relational experience. And I think, Emma, this is what you were talking about earlier, offering something new. Yeah. I'll finish going through this slide, and I will want to come back to the gallery just to get your reflections and any thoughts and questions, of course. So anti-oppressive practice then identifies the out there context. Okay, so we are then not saying that we exist in a bubble, in a vacuum. So we are straight away acknowledging that there is an out there context. And it is within that context that, as practitioners, as supervisors, as supervisees, as counsellors, and as clients, and our clients as well, that is the context in which we live. That is the context in which we have experiences of privilege and or oppression. Okay, and I think this again was reflected in Emily in talking about how kind of relaxed you feel and going, oh, I can bring it in and the space is getting bigger. We can acknowledge it. Yeah. And so ultimately what we are doing in anti-oppressive practice is that we are acknowledging that if it exists out there, it exists in here. We're acknowledging the structural inequalities of the in here context. And we are then working to, as I say, flatten the power, make it equal, because what we're trying to do is recognize where the power is in the in here space and where oppression might occur between counsellor and client in the therapeutic relationship, and between the supervisor and supervisee in the supervision relationship. So we can then offer a supervision process and relationship that holds both client, supervisee, so client with counsellor or supervisee with supervisor in equal regard, without then the client or our supervisees being marginalised, minoritised or othered. So essentially what we're doing is we're not recreating an oppressive dynamic in here. So that is the kind of fundamental pivot that we're doing in the in here space. And what we can recognise from this is the moment we make that pivot, the in here then looks very different. We are both bringing in the out there context, we are acknowledging the out there context for the lived experiences, for the experiences of both our supervisees and our clients, but we are also then ensuring that their experience in here is then not a repeat of it as well. So we're working at both those levels constantly. We're bearing in mind, let's bring the out there in here, and let's make sure the in here is anti-oppressive. Okay. Now, of course, you will get the slides. So, of course, by all means, make your own notes, but don't worry too much about needing to capture exactly what's on the slides, because you will get a copy of them. I'm going to stop the share and bring us back into gallery. Perhaps give yourselves maybe a couple of minutes just to sit and ponder, reflect, capture your thoughts. There's a lot there to process. Please capture for yourself thoughts, reflections, perhaps any questions that are coming up for you as well. Again, I just want to offer some space if anybody would like to share, reflect, feedback, or ask any questions.
Can I try and formulate something?
Please.
Something about on that spectrum, it's almost like therapy itself could be on that spectrum, like mentally well, mentally sick, or in terms of IFS, there's often this kind of binary, parts bad, self good, hierarchical, kind of oppressive, kind of something in the water. So somehow that's coming up in me in relation to not only the out there in here in the relational, but on the internal relational as well. There's kind of inequality, and oppression. And I guess that's partly why I came into the profession, because I felt down on one end of the spectrum. And therapy helped me move somewhere else in the spectrum, and I wanted to help offer other people changes on the spectrum. So yes, I'm just aware of loads of stuff coming up, and so yeah, thank you, really. Wow.
If I'm okay to speak.
Thank you, Emma. Cheryl, please.
That made me think about why the stakes are so high for practitioners to present as mentally well. You know, a range of views on how much we self-disclose around that, but of course maybe we want the privilege of being mentally well if we're setting ourselves up as therapists and supervisors.
Yes, that cliche that as therapists we should all be sorted, that fantasy that we are all okay, which absolutely is this fantasy that we all automatically end up at that end of the spectrum. Again, it's a way, another oppressive way of removing our humanity in the room and who we are as people. Really kind of making us look like a very 2D way.
Yeah, if I could just keep the floor to get my bit over with.
Please.
You seem to be talking about intersectionality. Is that a term that you use, that that, or is there something unhelpful about that as a term?
I do use the term intersectionality, absolutely. I think for me, it's not so much, how can I put it? I absolutely embrace the term intersectionality. I think how it gets utilised and used, I think is often people have the wrong idea of it, because it's really easy to fall into the trap of only then recognising our oppressed identities. And what I write about in the book is actually, if we are to fully embrace our intersectional identity, it is to acknowledge where we hold both oppressed identities and power identities.
Yes, so maybe that's my understanding of intersectionality, but I guess what you're saying is not everyone is using or applying it in a full way.
Yes, there's something about, we have to be able to recognise our whole identity, and within it we hold multiple identity characteristics, which I'll illustrate later with the identity wheel tool. But it's also for us to be honest with ourselves and go, actually, where do I hold power in my identity characteristics? Because I think it's far easier, perhaps safer, perhaps more socially acceptable for us to acknowledge where we are oppressed than it is to acknowledge where we hold power. Like it could be very easy for me to go through life thinking that all I ever am is oppressed because of my visible identity. But because they're visible, they hold greater weight. So I could really lean into that if I wanted to. But that would actually, and by doing that, I would actually minimize, ignore, avoid, deny where I hold power.
Yes, and I've seen the opposite tendency in white middle class therapists, that they're more ironically more comfortable owning their privilege than maybe they'll come across a client more privileged than them, or they're a woman, so they are still minoritized. So I'm kind of seeing the opposite, but
in that respect, and again, a tool we're going to have a look at later, I talk about scales, like old school scales, and I go, in our intersectionality, it's where do we can sit in the middle of that scale and go, I hold oppressed identities, I also hold power. And based on those levels of power and oppressed identities, how does that then show up in relationships? How does that get utilized in relationships? We'll be thinking a lot more about that throughout the day as well. But that's why I like to do it on a spectrum, because I kind of think, Myra, always remember that actually you end up in the middle because you hold both. Thank you, Cheryl.
Myra, what I was thinking when you mentioned bringing humanity into the room. Yeah.
Yes.
I was thinking Rogers, and I was thinking his concept of transparency. Is that what you sort of is that what you, on those lines are we talking about? Or not?
I think an aspect of it is transparency.
Yeah.
But of course, we've got to hold that very loosely, or carefully rather, next to self-disclosure and boundaries. So this is not about saying, right, here's all of me. But I think for me, it's about saying that I cannot leave behind the door or outside of the room aspects of my identity. I cannot leave outside of the room any of who I am. It's in the room with me.
Yeah.
Now, it might not be disclosed to the client. It might not even ever be named with a client. But for example, I'm going to, how can I put it? I can't sit in the room and say that, oh, I'm not oppressed, or no, I don't hold power, or it's in the room, it's in the relationship. I know that my accent is going to impact and influence how my clients and supervisees might perceive me, but that is not in isolation from my visible identities. It's not in isolation from qualifications. So there's something about recognizing that any aspect of my identity at any time is going to be impacting and influencing the process and the relationship. Yeah. And that's what I mean by bringing my lived experience or my identity fully into the room.
Yeah.
Rather than this idea about being a blank slate. I think the blank slate removes our humanness.
Yes.
And I'm sitting in the room going, no, I'm impacted by what my clients are telling me, what my supervisees are telling me, but also I'm impacted because of my identity. I'm impacted by my own lived experience. So it's about two people in relationship, not a client in relationship with a blank slate kind of thing. It's like, no, two whole people in the room in relationship with each other. Yeah.
I think that's what I was sort of thinking about as well, in terms of like, I had a couple of thoughts, which is like how to balance this with elements of supervision that are in some ways holding like an ethical framework for our supervisees, for example. Yes. And then working with young people that can change the dynamic as well, because of the power dynamics that kind of automatically are in place in terms of being older and things like that, and safeguarding it can take it completely into a different space. Yes. But also what you were just saying, it's reminding me of transference and countertransference, and the element of like, when you go then to your own therapy or supervision, to be thinking about what is it that your supervisees, clients are igniting in yourself and reminding you of, and things like that. So yes. I don't know if there is a parallel, but I guess that's what it's also reminding me of.
It's a parallel, but also it's just showing us that it's all connected. Like this idea that we can just leave ourselves outside the door. It's not. It's because we are impacted by, we are connecting with, we are attuning to. This is the piece that Marie spoke to about earlier, about if we are attuning to our supervisees and our clients as counsellors and supervisors, we absolutely are connecting our experiences, our own internal humanity with theirs. And so we are impacted by it, we are triggered by it, as aspects of our own, maybe parts, as Emma, you referred to, parts of our own lived experiences, part of our own experiences of oppression or power are being activated in us. And if we are not aware of that, guess what happens? We will then react to that, to our client or supervisee, from a place of maybe either going into an oppressed position with them or a oppressor position, and then wanting to dominate and assert our power over it. Because if we are not aware of how we experience and relate to power and oppression based on our own lived experiences out there, guess what? There's going to be this forever reactive machine to the stuff that our clients and supervisees are bringing.
Yes, no, thank you, Myra. That self-awareness is crucial, really. Yeah.
Yeah.
Self-awareness.
Yeah. And I'm mindful of, again, thinking about, and again, we'll be thinking about this even more today, but we hold so much power in our positions as counsellors and supervisors that if we are not acknowledging power and oppression dynamics out there, we are then not acknowledging how it gets brought into the in here space. Guess what? We end up just recreating it in here, and we then start being abusive, we start being harmful, we start being the oppressor in here. And that's why we can easily fall into this trap of oppressive practice, even though we say, no, what, I'm being ethical. This is, for me, to be ethical is to work in an anti-oppressive manner. They go hand in hand.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying about, we can't leave any aspect out there of who we are, because if we're ignoring the fact that I experience oppression, well, how on earth am I going to deal with it when it shows up in my therapeutic or supervision relationships? I can't separate the two. If I'm not aware of how I'm going to want to respond to it, react to it, defend maybe, or avoid, ignore it, deny it, collude with it, there are so many ways in which I can end up reinforcing that power one way or another, if I'm not aware that I'm proactively working with it, consciously, intentionally working with it. Yeah. Any other thoughts or reflections at all?
No, I think for me, Iman, you started to verbalize something which I was kind of sitting with when you mentioned about the transference and counter-transference. I think I've been sitting here just thinking about all the layering that's happening, and maybe my brain is still half on cake. I was thinking about, just because of all the different relationships that are brought into the supervisory space. Of course, we know that obviously the clients are being brought in even if they're not present, and the power then that we have in having those discussions when that person isn't present to be part of them. And I think that there's something I feel like I almost can't quite verbalize yet, but there was something about that layering and how we're able to break that oppression down when a person who's involved within the discussions isn't even present, and how we're able then to do that.
Yes, really important point. We are going to be thinking about that today when we get to the actual model that we're going to be looking at, and we're going to spend like majority of this afternoon actually looking at the model, because that's hopefully what you'll then be able to, that will be a framework that you can then take back into your supervision. But exactly that, which is, how might we be consciously or unconsciously colluding with the power we hold in the room as supervisor and supervisee over the client, who then is not in the room. And you can start to see that, oh gosh, actually, we can start to, between me and my supervisee, we can actually start to become quite oppressive over the client and the work that happens in the room. It's definitely something we have to be mindful of in anti-oppressive practice, which of course, if we were just doing kind of, I'll call it regular supervision, this is the real kind of danger, or the penny dropping moment. That's been happening all this time in supervision without us knowing that there is this potential that us as supervisees, or as the supervisor, if we're not aware of that, we might have been oppressing our clients that have not been in the room without realizing it. We might be wanting to move the work on or do something in the practice or process that actually is a power over the client. Yeah. Really important point, and we'll think a lot more about that this afternoon with the model. Yeah. I'm mindful of the time to go for a break, time just to take some time to reflect, get away from the screen, just process, but more importantly, digest, both physically and metaphorically. Whatever you want to eat or drink, probably cake by the time it gets to lunchtime anyway, or at least this afternoon. If we come back then at 11:40, okay, and then we'll crack on. Okay, I'm going to be around in my office if people need to check in with me during the break, okay. We have a minute or so, so when people are ready to come back, just to give you like a 1 minute little mini alarm. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. What we're going to do is spend then the next part of the next section rather, to in deconstructing oppression, then, as I said, with this cake metaphor that we're going to run with today, how we then reconstruct it as anti-oppressive practice and supervision. Just want to check in with everybody, any reflections or thoughts or questions before we dive into the next bit at all? Anybody want any clarifications or want to check out anything before we move on? No, heads nodding. Okay. So based on this kind of idea that we're pivoting from a kind of default oppressive position to anti-oppressive position, the reason why I then contextualize it within this bigger this model of working within diversity is that the moment we take up a position of working within diversity, that is an anti-oppressive position, but it also offers us a way of thinking about identity in relationships. Okay, so that's also the reason why we are thinking about working within diversity. If you're wondering, well, where does that come in thinking about anti-oppressive supervision, it's because if to move from oppression to anti-oppressive practice is to acknowledge systems of oppression, to acknowledge structural and systemic inequalities out there, the reason that all happens is because of identity. Like, our identities hold influence over what those experiences are. And so the moment we then recognize that this is all about identity, we then have to also think about identity in an anti-oppressive way. We have to pivot in thinking about identity and diversity in an anti-oppressive way rather than from a current oppressive position. Okay, so this is where we start linking concepts of oppression. We're moving from oppression to anti-oppression. We're moving from working with to working within, because ultimately what we are needing to do is acknowledge that our lived experiences, our experience of the world, is ultimately based on who we are in our identities. And that's everything we are then going to be exploring with clients in there and what they bring in their narratives, but also, of course, what we have to hold in mind as supervisors. Okay. So again, walking us through then what it is then to think about identity. Oh, I need to reshare this as a screen slide. Thinking then about identity, in moving and thinking about identity from a oppressive position, as we have already perhaps been taught how to think about diversity and identity, to moving into an anti-oppressive way and thinking about diversity and identity. And as I said, the reason we need to do that is because we cannot be anti-oppressive without repositioning how we think about diversity and identity, because it's looking at identity in a whole different way and through a new lens. So just as I kind of took that stance of current practice is oppressive unless we are intentionally being anti-oppressive, this stems from the reason why current practice is oppressive is because of how it sees diversity and identity, how we are taught what identity is. And for me, this is really captured in this phrase, working with diversity and or difference. And I you know, it will be good to kind of just quickly check in with yourselves. How were you taught about diversity and identity in your training? Was it with this phrase or a combination of a phrase along the lines of working with diversity and or difference? I know that when I trained, I had not even a 1 day, it was a half a day training on working with diversity and or difference. And I'll share my actual experience of it with you in a moment, like my study that they gave us. If you've read the book, spoiler alert, it's in there, but some of you might be aware of it. But there is something about how we are taught about identity, I think, just gets kind of shoved into, minimized and crammed into this phrase, working with diversity. And as you can see from this slide, I clearly have I'll own it, I have a problem with that phrase, because fundamentally I do believe it's oppressive. And again, those of you that are visual, I'm going with lots of diagrams with these slides then throughout the day. So for me, when we think about working with diversity or working with diversity and or difference, our starting point in thinking about working with clients is that in the room, we have a counsellor and a client. Absolutely, this is also applicable to supervision. In the supervision room, what we would have is a supervisor and a supervisee. So it's parallel, yeah, so it's interchangeable with the supervision relationship. But that's our starting point in this relationship. And in working with difference or diversity, we recognise that the counsellor is in therapeutic relationship with the client. Supervision version is a supervisor is in supervision relationship with a supervisee. And the counsellor's attention is on the client. The supervisor's attention is on the supervisee in a traditional way in thinking about identity or diversity. And with this focus on the client or supervisee, when we are working with diversity or we are thinking about identity, we are thinking about diversity and identity being with and living with the client or supervisee. And whenever I see this picture, it always reminds me, whenever I see this thing about diversity lives here, I immediately think of those blue English heritage plaques that they have on the side of buildings, like Charles Dickens lived here or somebody famous died here. It's like those blue. And so the reason I think of those English heritage plaques is because by saying that we work with diversity and or difference, we are locating diversity and therefore identity with the client or supervisee. And we are then claiming that them, the client or supervisee, that by them being diverse and different, it is the client's identity that is diverse and different. Yeah. So it's the equivalent of that blue English heritage plaque living with the client or supervisee. That individual is diverse or different and or different. And by identity then belonging with the client or supervisee and their identity then being diverse and or different, it has to be diverse and different from somebody else. By saying that somebody is diverse or different, it is a comparative term. They have to be diverse and different. And guess what? It ends up being that they are diverse and different from the counsellor or supervisor. Yeah. So by the very nature of saying that diversity belongs or lives with the client or supervisee, we are then claiming that we are setting up a dynamic that therefore then the client's identity or supervisee's identity is diverse and different. And because it's a comparative term, they have to be diverse and different from me, the counsellor or supervisor. Everyone with me so far? I know you're muted, but nodding heads. Yep, because I can see you. Okay. So not only are we labelling the client or supervisee as diverse and or different, and therefore diverse and different from me, the counsellor or supervisor, it then places a particular identity on the counsellor or normative, centred and neutral. That if the diversity and difference lives with the client or supervisee, by default then comparatively to if the client or supervisee is diverse and different, it immediately positions me then as normative, centred or neutral in my identity. That I take up a dominant position. It's an oppressive position to say that in our identity, we are centered and neutral. And what I mean by centered and neutral is that I am the dominant identity, that by being dominant, I am a neutral. I hold no particular value in my identity. And therefore, who I am is I am the norm in this relationship, in this context. And it is you, the client or supervisee, who is different and diverse. And so the counsellor or supervisor then takes up an oppressive, powerful position in the relationship. Because we then, as the supervisor or counsellor, are claiming that our own identity then is the norm. Yeah. And by being the norm, then I get located at that power end of the spectrum, in which I sit with the power, the privilege, the advantage. I sit with the dominance and the supremacy, because who I am is normal, normative. It's in the centre of any spectrum. It's a false claim, of course, but we claim that we take up a position of being centred and neutral. So this is the deconstruction of working with diversity and or difference as reinforced by the profession, as reinforced in our training. And this actually is the relationship then that unintentionally and consciously gets recreated in our supervision and therapeutic relationships. Any thoughts or reflections on that at this stage? This being then this is the deconstruction of our oppressive cake. These are the ingredients that we come with. Any thoughts or reflections? Shall I stop sharing for a second so everyone can see each other? Oh, she says, trying to get the cursor to work. There we go. Any
Myira,
thoughts or reflections? Cheryl, please.
Say how we would marry this up with the idea that it can be good anti-oppressive practice to name difference. So as a white therapist and supervisor, to name that difference in the room where it's there and say, it's okay to talk to me about racism if you've experienced it. And if you see me as a representative of the oppressor, I understand that, but I'm mentioning this to signal my allyship. So can you kind of say if the
Yes. So absolutely. So if we look at it from the oppressive position first, by being centered, neutral, and normative, we ignore the fact that we have identity entirely. Yeah, with that blank slate, it reinforces that position of being the blank slate. Yeah. And so our identity is literally outside of the room. And so who I am and who each of us are in our visible identities is just completely, it's like the elephant in the room that never gets acknowledged. What we'll see with the working within diversity model then is exactly what you're saying, Cheryl, which is I'm bringing back into the room and into the relationship my identity. So then in working within diversity, we are then absolutely very first step of working within diversity is to acknowledge that there are two identities in the room. So to acknowledge then, Cheryl, as you were saying, actually, I'm a white woman. Not only what does that mean in terms of power dynamics, but also what's that going to mean for the impact on the actual process and relationship? How might that open up my counsellor or supervisee? How might it shut it down if I'm not careful? Yeah, starting to really acknowledge the power, the inherent power in your identity. Without you even saying a word, your whiteness, your femaleness is going to be having an influence on how the other person relates to you.
Great, thank you.
And it's absolutely, and it's absolutely not about good or bad. It's not binary. It can be both at the same time. It's about going, how might this help this? How might this help the process and relationship? How might it hinder? And what do I need to acknowledge? What do we need to work and what do we need to name together? What do we need to work through or work on or explore together in order for that to be understood between us? Yeah. And that's really at the heart of this work. And of course, we'll be thinking much more about that as we move throughout the day. But yes, exactly. Naming it is acknowledging it is the first step. Step 2 is naming it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or reflections? Yes, in kind of deconstructing our oppressive cake. Any thoughts about that? No, we don't. Iman, please.
Yeah. No, I guess I was thinking about how sometimes as being even like visibly Muslim can allow, I guess in a positive-ish way, allow clients or supervisees to be the ones to notice it on behalf of, for example, myself, where they'll use it as a way of kind of being like, oh, you must understand, which is quite interesting for their processing in terms of like that almost already positioning you in a I guess like knowing what it's like to be oppressed position to then understand their position in whatever it is that they're experiencing.
Yes.
And how interesting that is to sometimes work with, like just generally. I guess like I've often like reflected about it in supervision where it's like, oh, it's interesting like how you're often viewed, because I used to think it might sometimes hinder people's ability to talk to me about certain things, whereas actually I had like consecutively like clients who are sort of using my identities to inform their understanding of themselves, which was all like trying to connect in that way, I guess.
Yes.
And so it's like quite interesting when your identities are being, I guess, brought into the space just naturally, I guess, or like by the client, as opposed to which definitely helps the process, and I guess like is making me think about what it would be like if that was just automatically sort of there. But yeah, like I don't know if I've made any sense, but
no, absolutely. I think you're speaking to two aspects here. I think one is that our identity is going to be having an influence irrespective. So, and that influence can be good or bad, not based on how we think of it, based on what the client or supervisee thinks of it. And I think that's really important to hold on to, because it can be the very same identity within us can be positive for one client or supervisee, but be quite detrimental or a barrier to somebody else. And I think, again, it's about sitting with the honesty and the transparency that is happening in the process or relationship. And to acknowledge also, I think in what you're saying, Iman, as well, is that clients are going to be alluding to it and are going and potentially going to bring it up before we do anyway. And if we listen closely enough, the response for me is a huge, big klaxon in my sessions in my brain to go, there is something being acknowledged here about what I call our cultural closeness, which then needs to be unpacked. So the response is an acknowledgement of a cultural closeness and an identity closeness between me and my client, or me and my supervisee. And what they are doing is it's a bit of a fast forward, but they've gone, well, Myra is this Muslim Asian woman, in which then they've gone, because of that similarity or closeness between us, she must know. And whenever I hear the and the klaxon goes off in my head, I will immediately be like, you say but I recognize I have my lived experience of being, and I'll insert the identity characteristic in relation to what they're talking about, or I'll say, what might that be in relation to? But it's in order to get that person, then the client or supervisee, to go, well, what is it specifically that you think that I'm understanding here? Can you say more? I don't know, because I'm not you. I have my experience of it, but I don't have your experience. So it's an opportunity to open that up, because a response does two things. It will bring you immediately closer, but it's based on a fantasy of the client or supervisee, based on a level of projection.
Is that frozen for me? Just
did I?
Hi. Yeah, you went.
Oh, sorry. Oh, where did you lose me at? Talking about
projection.
Based on
projection. Okay, yeah. So based on projection, thank you. Based on that projection, it brings the two of you closer, but actually it's a false closeness, because that leapfrogs a whole cavern of actually exploring the client or supervisee's experience of it. Because the moment we collude with it and go, yes, oh, yeah, yeah, and we might unintentionally nod our heads in response to the you know, what we're doing then is we might miss an opportunity to explore that with the client or supervisee. Yeah. So this is what I'm saying about our identity is so already in the room without us realizing it's having that level of influence. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting exploration, like thinking about how that invitation to join that comes from the person we're working with actually just ignores all the barriers that are still there.
Yes. Yeah. And if we're not aware of those barriers, actually, and this is kind of the default of working in an oppressive manner, we would go in it, perhaps our ego, in our need to want to show that we understand, in us being this blank slate or us being this really empathic counselor, we kind of want to lean into the I know all that and all that, but that sense of wanting to agree with them. But actually all we're doing is we're colluding, as you said, Emily, we're colluding with their barriers, we're colluding with the defenses, with the false closeness. And it's a false understanding, actually. I think we do a massive disservice by doing that. Yeah. So it's very, you can start to see it's very subtle, but this is how identity and diversity, how we can work with it in a way that is anti-oppressive and acknowledging the full kind of richness of their lived experience. Yeah. Any other thoughts before we kind of go back to the slide deck? Okay, I'll screen share again. So what we're going to move on to then is, as we've actually already been talking about then, so what will it look like then if we are then working within diversity? We're moving, pivoting then from this oppressive position of working with diversity, from not acknowledging our identity, into what I call working within diversity. So working within diversity is the same starting point, of which, of course, in any therapeutic or supervision relationship, we have counsellor, client, or supervisor and supervisee. From this point on, it's all different, because when we are in a therapeutic relationship or supervisory relationship, we're acknowledging that we are not a blank slate and that we are two people in relationship, which then immediately places identity with both people. I talk about in this model, one of the principles in this model is that in any relationship, for every person, there is an identity. And so if in a therapeutic or supervision relationship, if there are two people, there are two identities in the room, okay? And the moment we acknowledge that there are two identities in the room, we recognize then that rather than diversity belonging with or living with one person or the other, we both exist within diversity. Because nobody, what we are recognizing then, that in our identities there is going to be identity similarities and closeness, as well as identity distances and differences. But it's not about somebody being different and diverse from somebody else who is being neutral. There is no neutrality in this. We are not blank slates. We recognize that both myself and my clients and my supervisees, that by being in relationship, there are those two identities in the relationship, and that we all exist within diversity. So there is nobody in this. Another one of my metaphors here is I always see this as a swimming pool. Both of us are in the swimming pool of diversity. There is nobody here that takes a position of neutrality or normative or centered. And by doing that, nobody then takes up a dominant position in their identity over the other. But rather instead, through recognizing we hold that intersectional identity, we recognize where there is power in an aspect of our identity, but we are not doing that because we take up a position of neutrality or normative or being centered. Yeah. So yeah, for those of you that like the metaphors and the visuals, this is the swimming pool of diversity, and we are all in it. So nobody has the power or privilege, literal privilege, to be normative, centered, or neutral. And this gives us the opportunity then to go, I can bring my identity into the room. It was already there, but we are now consciously and intentionally acknowledging it. So when we're thinking about working within diversity, we are moving away from that English heritage plaque of diversity belonging with a person. And it no longer and we're pivoting into working within diversity. Diversity then no longer belongs to a person. It is a concept that we all belong within. So it's no longer a name badge for an individual. Nobody is now labelled as diverse or different from somebody centred or neutral. Instead, we're recognising the richness of each of our own identities, and that it's those identities then that are in relationship with each other. Again, I will stop sharing, I'll give yourselves a minute or so just to capture any reflections or thoughts. And then I can invite some space for us to think about this together.
I guess I'm thinking about the sometimes parallel process that can happen in supervision, which is like between the therapist and client, and then you and the supervisee sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I don't have a really formulated question, but I guess like I'm just curious as to how that would be, or that would look like, or how that would play out in like how that can kind of be worked with, explored, considered in supervision.
The working within diversity.
Yeah, and recognizing that within kind of what the therapist is talking about their client, what might be then happening between you, what's going on for the therapist, like all those elements.
Absolutely. All of those elements are very neatly packaged in the supervision model that I'm going to be walking us through this afternoon. But it's exactly that. You're quite right though, Iman, which is, gosh, the moment we start to recognize that it's about identity, and there's then going to be multiple identities to be thought about in supervision. There's mine as the supervisor, the identity of my supervisee, the identity of my clients. There's
and
a
group
lot.
Therapy and group supervision.
And group supervision. Yes, the multiplied. Yes, if you're in group supervision, of course, the identities of multiple people in supervision. All of that has to be considered in terms of what power is being utilised and how are people being oppressed. That's kind of a bookmarked question that I'm always thinking about in any of my clinical practice, whether that's in counselling or supervision, which is how are the power dynamics being played out here? Where is power being exerted and where are people being oppressed? And kind of a follow-on question to that is, and where is there collusion for that to happen? Is there collusion for that power? And is there collusion for people to be oppressed? But you're absolutely right, Iman. It's like, gosh, we have to consider now all of that in supervision. You know, there's something about whenever I'm teaching this to, you know, when we have our counsellors hats on, we're going, gosh, that's a lot just as a counsellor and a client to think about. And then the moment we put it into this broader perspective of supervision, there is a lot more. You are spinning more plates, essentially. There is more to hold and to consider when it's in supervision. But that's why I'm hoping the model will offer you some structure to that.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts in us moving away from oppressive to anti-oppressive to, again, metaphorically from a label of, or a label, the badge of diversity with the client or supervisee, and us moving into, technically, metaphorically diving into a swimming pool of diversity. Any thoughts or reflections, Emily?
I was just going to say, just that's such a subtle switch in wording, but it's so powerful and so effective. And I think it makes me feel quite frustrated that my training didn't get it, that actually, you know, there just wasn't the teaching that really properly positioned this in that way. And yeah, I feel really grateful actually just to hear it reconceptualized in the way that you have, because that shift, I think, is such a vital one, and I think it's really illuminating to be able to think of it in that way.
Yeah. Thank you, Emily. I'm also thinking about what you said earlier, that feeling that you spoke about feeling, the relief. Like, how nice is it for us to, well, there's something about that. It's always refreshing to jump into a swimming pool, frankly, anyway, but also there's something very metaphorical about that. That's why I deliberately use that metaphor as well, because I think there's something about, by being in that swimming pool, I'm not being asked to be anything else. I'm not being asked to be a blank slate. And also, I give myself permission in this space then to name identity, and to, you know, it actually invites us, it offers a space, it gives us permission, it invites us to be able to think about, actually, me as a visible Muslim woman, or me being brown, maybe Asian, maybe whatever it might be about my identity, how is that impacting you, supervisee or client? How might that be impacting on how we work together, what you feel able to bring or not bring? Like, it gives us the freedom to do that. Yeah.
Myra?
Emma, yes.
Something from what Emily said. Is there something that it seems to be, I feel that only somebody from your identity, could have brought this model. Part of the fact of our teaching failing us in this area is because it was used by white men.
Yes.
Who are kind of, you know, it's their swimming pool. Sorry, that's not right. So I don't know if that's something you feel, or yeah. I don't
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I think it works if we take it back to that broader picture of systems of oppression serve the oppressors. And who are the oppressors within the profession? And who are the people then that are teaching this? Very often they hold the identities of oppressors, historically, politically, and systemically within the profession, they will hold those positions. So people in the very privileged position of teaching it are going to want to offer a practice that serves them. There's that phrase of, you can't dismantle, well, I will absolutely butcher this, and I apologize for butchering this quote, but you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And so there's something about what we can't do is dismantle current or traditional practice with the very tools that they are asking us to do it with, because their very tools are oppressive. That's the equivalent of going, go back to that baking metaphor. That's the equivalent of going, can you please bake us an anti-oppressive cake, but with the same ingredients that you've used to bake the oppressive cake with? Just isn't going to happen. Is it going to end up with another oppressive cake? Yeah. Yeah. But no, thank you for kind of naming that, Emma. It is about being able to offer something that sits outside of traditional teaching. The reason I use the word traditional a lot more now is because I appreciate that actually training is changing. And I do teach people that have done training recently, and so they may not have had that experience. But for the vast majority of us, we have come from the traditional working with diversity training that is oppressive. Yeah. So thank you for naming that, Emma. Yeah. Cheryl, you had your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to continue with the food metaphors. When I think about how useful it is to mainstream anti-oppressive practice rather than seeing it as an add-on, I sometimes think of it as a sort of word running through a stick of rock. So like frightened going all the way through the stick of rock, rather than the box of fudge, which is generic inside and it's just got the destination. You know, on the box outside. It's about kind of having it run all the way through.
Yes. And I think that's why, absolutely, another great metaphor there. I will be using that one as well.
Feel free, anyone, it's not copyrighted.
Yes. And this is what I think this really kind of speaks to what I said kind of at the start of the day, which is this is really to change something from the inside out. This isn't just an add-on. It isn't just doing one thing differently. It's not tweaking something. This is fundamentally changing our practice. And I think, Myira, you really spoke to that piece earlier as well. It's like, it's making me reflect my entire practice. In a nutshell, good. Like, it's meant to. Like, and that's what anti-oppressive practice does. It will question the fundamentals of our current practice. And that's the process, that's the journey that I've been on for like the last however many years that I've been working as a therapist. So yeah. Yes, it's changing it fundamentally from the inside out. Yeah. Okay. Myira, please. Yeah. Oh, you're muted. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Yes.
What I'm recognizing, Myira, thank you for this, is that somehow in my practice is just I have been half, if you want, using this, talking about my identity in the sessions with the client, but it's only half of it. I did not offer the client an opportunity to, as you can see, about my accent and background and everything else. So half of it, I've been using this model sort of unaware of it somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what I'm learning today is, it's a lot I'm learning today. But I was just realizing that, you know what, you have been actually sort of tried at least to work in it, and you know,
I'm sure for many it's about naming. And it's naming things that we go, I have perhaps been doing this. This gives it a structure.
Yeah.
Oh, we've just lost Emma, haven't we? Hopefully she was frozen for a second. Hopefully she'll come back in a minute. But absolutely, I think it's about giving concepts, names, a framework to be able to do this. Yeah. So what we'll do, well, hopefully Emma will be back with us shortly. What we're going to do then is very, very quickly look at kind of the principles that sit beneath the working within diversity model. So I do want to kind of build on that. And then we're going to really jump into thinking about its application in supervision. Okay, so go back to the screen share. So the slide I had showed you, as I said, is kind of the first building block to the full working within diversity model. So once we understand that this is what working within diversity is as a concept, when we then think about, well, how do we then work with this model in practice, in supervision and in therapy itself, I've then created a full 5-component model with it. So on the next slide will be the full model of the working within diversity concept. So we take that swimming pool and we add to it, okay? So the very first thing we do is we take that swimming pool and we recognize that the swimming pool exists within a broader context, the external context that we've been talking about all morning, yeah? And so component number 1 of the model is the structural and systemic context of counselling, both within the profession and externally in the broader wide world. Okay. If you just give me 1 second, I think Emma might be trying to contact me. Yeah, she's just having problems with her internet, and hopefully we'll jump back on soon. Apologies for that. So, as we've been saying, you know, we're not in this kind of hermetically sealed bubble of counselling or supervision. So this swimming pool exists within the wider context of both the profession and the broader societal world. So component number one is structural and systemic contexts, okay? And then within our swimming pool, we can then start to see that when we are working within diversity, what aspects of our work help us to acknowledge diversity and identity. And of course, the very main aspect of this is identity itself. So the second component of this model is thinking about and reflecting on and utilising and using in the work our identity and intersectionality. And interestingly here, just to note, that this is located with both counsellor and client. Remember I said that there are two identities. So it's not just the identity of the client, which would be working with diversity. This is both identities. Applying this more broadly, it would be the identities of supervisor and supervisee. And as Iman, you alluded to, absolutely in group supervision, it would be the number of people in that group. However many people are in that group or space is the equivalent number of identities. So component number two being identities. Component number 3, 4, and 5 then refer to actually what's going on then in the room, in supervision or in counselling. Component number 3 then recognising power. What power is being held in the relationship because of identity? And how is power being experienced and used and utilised in the in-here space? Component number 4 then is saying, focuses on the therapeutic relationship itself. What is going on in the relationship because of who the two people are, because of who the two identities are? And the fifth component then being, within the relationship, within the in-here space, what is actually happening in the therapeutic process itself? And helping us to think about why is what is happening in the process, why is it happening? Because of power, because of identity, because of how two people are relating to each other. Okay, so that's the 5-component model of working within diversity. It's an anti-oppressive model of practice. Okay, and so based on this model, then we then as supervisors can first of all directly think about, well, how is this happening or playing out between my supervisee and their clients? Yeah, at a very initial way of applying this in supervision, we can sit with our supervisees and go, okay, well, let's explore then, what is your identity? What is your client's identity? And let us explore then what is happening in the in-here process between the two of you. And how is that playing out through power? How is it playing out in the relationship? And how is it playing out in the process? Okay. So this is how, let me say this two different ways, well, 2 parts to this. One is, as counsellors, we can use this model at face value. Yes, as counsellors, we can sit there in our sessions and go, am I considering all 5 components, or am I exploring one component in particular? As supervisees, we can support our clients to use this model. Okay. So as counsellors, we can apply it directly to our own clinical work. And as supervisors, we can support our clients to use this framework. So just give yourselves a moment just to capture any thoughts or reflections on this, and then we'll open it up for a discussion. So just to kind of reinforce that this is, as counsellors, this is the model we can use in our own clinical practice. As supervisors, this is the framework we can support our counsellors to help them think about their clinical practice. We have an adapted version of this for our actual supervision itself, if that makes sense. Yeah. So in terms of thinking about, is our, as a counsellor, is our own practice anti-oppressive? Am I looking at all of these 5 components? As a supervisor, are my supervisees considering all 5 of these components? So as a counsellor, this model in and of itself is sufficient, like, because it encompasses everything as counsellors that we need to think about. And I do other trainings to look specifically at these components. As supervisors, we will then think this 5 component model, are our supervisees, are our counsellors looking at all 5 components? And then for ourselves, we have our own model that we then use in supervision itself, okay? So essentially you're getting kind of 2 models in of one today. But as I said, as counsellors, this is the complete model, okay? I'm going to stop sharing, bring us back into gallery. Hopefully Emma will be joining us. Double check she hasn't tried to. No, that's fine. So as I said, that this is kind of the working within diversity model from a counsellor's perspective, and of course as supervisors we can support our counsellors to think about it. Any thoughts or reflections on the model, or on any aspect of the model, or how you might be thinking about it as a supervisor or as a counsellor actually? Any kind of initial thoughts to it or reflections on it? Cheryl?
It was really reminding me of the mode 7 in the 7-eyed model of supervision. I don't know if others trained with that model of supervision. And also it's kind of reminding me of Mick Cooper's pluralistic therapy that he's kind of talking about recently. So I just wanted to share that those noticings with you.
Oh, do you know what? I'm really pleased that it kind of hints to the 7-eyed model, because we will be looking at something very similar to that when we look at our anti-oppressive supervision model. So I'm glad that it's alluding to that, because it will flow into that throughout the day. But yes, thank you. Yeah. Any other thoughts or reflections on the model? Now, I appreciate that that's not the supervision model. However, it's a model for anti-oppressive practice that we can, in a way, that's the model we give to our supervisees, if that makes sense, or that's a model in which we can support our supervisees to go, well, 2 ways. It's both a way for our supervisees, our counsellors, to help them think about what they're doing in the room themselves, but also it's a really good model for them to reflect on their sessions after every session. Or you think, you know, which components have you thought about this session? Which ones are impacting? Which ones it's really useful, the 5 components, to also point out any blind spots that your supervisees may not have paid attention to. So the 5 component model is a tool for your counsellors, for your supervisees. Yeah. Iman, please.
Sorry.
No, please.
Yeah, I think this would be also good for short-term models.
Yes.
If people are working within, for example, like a 6, 7, 8, 12 session model, maybe that's like a great way of just like encapsulating or formulating like what might be happening within that. I think I just had like a realization.
Yes, and I'm really pleased you said that, because the thing with anti-oppressive practice is that, as I said, it's not just adding one thing in. It's actually, what we're doing is we're taking a number of different components and we're adding it all together. And in the model, it's those 5 components. But again, as we work our way through the day, how we can look at those different components, there are particular tools for each one. So for example, the component number 3, power, well, guess what? We've already got the system or spectrum of oppression tool to help us figure out which end of the spectrums are we falling on. And there are some adapted tools that we'll look at later on this afternoon that build on that as well. So it's taking all 5 components, going, which ones am I addressing, which ones are we exploring in session, but also you're going to get tools today to actually help you to do that as well. Yeah. So it's in a way, it's kind of an all-encompassing model. It's not just one thing. It's like it's a combination of tools and concepts. I know it's a bit of a cliche to say it's a toolkit, you know, the idea of, oh, there are all these things in toolkit. I don't quite like that term itself, but in a model, within the model, there are multiple ways to kind of get into it, or to apply it, or to think about it. And you'll get a number of those tools throughout the day. Yeah. It will make sense by the end of the day. We're building, that's the thing, it's not one thing, we're building it throughout the day. So we've already kind of introduced the spectrum of oppression. We've already introduced now the anti-oppressive model, 5 components. Yeah. And then we're going to be adding on more tools to actually help us think about that in supervision. Yeah. Any other?
I think
Emily?
I was a curiosity actually, and feeds a little bit into what Myira was talking about earlier, when you said, Myira, about having noticed that you had elements that you felt were already within how you were working. And I suppose it was just a question about whether you found from your personal experience of kind of using this practice, whether there are any common blind spots, like you mentioned, like people having blind spots within the model, like whether you notice that practitioners or the clients or supervisees, whether people have any one or any common elements that actually they are more likely to overlook than others.
Yeah. That's a really good question, Emily. I would, off the top of my head, I would say that it is a combination of how identity and power are linked and relate to one another. So I think there is definitely more that has been done to teach power, but it's teaching power separate from identity. So, for example, I think we have, I think we're more familiar with the idea that the role of counsellor holds power, or the role of supervisor holds power and authority. And I'm going, great, but that's only power in relation to one aspect of my identity in the room. What's really being missed is, what about the rest of my identities, and how might they be connected to a level of power or oppression? And how am I then unconsciously or unintentionally, or consciously and intentionally maybe, actually using that to oppress my client or supervisee? So I think that kind of almost because it's quite a powerful, it's like it's a bit like a firework going off, gosh, mixing identity with power, and gosh, that power, and literally that the potential for that to be an explosive combination, literally in the room, and doing harm to our clients or supervisees. I think that's the thing that gets missed, because I think we don't want to acknowledge that in the rest of our identities we might hold power and privilege or oppression. Yeah.
So really, I guess thinking about how it's that blind spot's often triggered by real discomfort.
Yes. Yeah. We don't want to acknowledge actually that maybe I have privilege and I like my privilege. I like the advantages I get from that particular privileged identity within me. Yeah. So I want to downplay it. I don't want to acknowledge it. And so I'll ignore it. And in a way, then I think what we then all do, it's almost like mass collusion. We move all of the power and privilege we might have in other aspects of our identity, and I think we shift it all, like putting eggs all in one basket. I think we locate it all in the role of counsellor and supervisor. Does that make sense? Like when we put it all in that one basket and go, well, no, my power is only because I'm it's because I'm a counsellor, or because I'm a supervisor, and I'm ignoring that actually I have power and privilege and advantage because of my accent, for example. Yeah. But really good question. Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
I was just thinking what you were saying within that, because I was thinking, like, even then that you could argue that you could go even more into that, like if you're to, for example, consider like colorism and the privileges within that, or if you're thinking about levels of religiosity and the privileges within that, and like all these like dynamics that can really like I don't know, become quite like significant, but they're very subtle.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yes, so it's this reconnecting in a way, I think, is what I'm saying. It's the biggest blind spot is the fact that we have not connected where we hold power with particular aspects of our identity. And I think what this model does is go, no, reconnect them together, and go, where do I hold power in it? Which of my identities hold power, and how am I intentionally or unintentionally using that in the room? Yeah. So yeah.
I don't know, Myira, Myra, sorry, what I'm thinking here. I'm thinking power. I'm associating power with a quality, humility for some reason. I don't know why I'm thinking that. As a counselor, I really don't know.
Power is humility.
Yes, power versus humility.
Power versus humility. Okay, yeah. Should I speak to that for a minute? Yeah.
Please, yeah.
Because what's come to my mind is that whenever we think of power, I think it's really easy to think of power as being all bad. And power can only be a particular form of power. And interestingly, there are actually 4 forms of power, because I think what we often do when we think of power, we think of power through the one definition, which is oppressive power, which is what we call power over. And so I think whenever we think about power in counselling and supervision, when we think about power out there, I think we only think about that one type of power and it being power over. Actually, there are other forms of power that are about power within, power with, power in between. So we can hold power within us and utilize that to help ourselves. We can use power with to support somebody else. I think that's the humility part, I think, Myira, that you're speaking to. So and we can hold power in between, which is we can between us and in between the space between 2 people, we can utilize power for something good. It's the 4th form of power, power over, that is the unhealthy, toxic, oppressive type of power. And it is that type of power that we want to be mindful that we are not taking the power that we hold and using it in a power over form. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
And so we absolutely hold power in the position we have as counsellors. It is how are we utilising that power? We can never get rid of our power when we are a counsellor or a supervisor, but it is how we are using it. And this is where anti-oppressive practice comes in, because it's inviting us to use power as power with, within, and in between, and ensuring that we're not using it as power over. And so when I think you speak to the piece about humility, I think it comes from a place of, because we want to help people, we want to support people, but we inevitably have a level of power in the fact that we are helping and supporting somebody. We can't not, if yes. The very reason we are in the room with a client or a supervisee is because we hold the power to do that. So, and that's not wrong. It's not wrong to have, and it's not bad to have that power, but recognize then that it's to use it as power with and in between. Yeah. Rather than power over. That's and I think it really highlights that that's why when I talk about flattening power, when I talk about equaling power, notice that I'm not talking about getting rid of power. Notice that I'm not talking about let's try and remove any power that we have, because we can't. For the very nature of being in the room and having the positions that we have, wanting to help people, wanting to support our supervisees and clients, we have power. We can't get rid of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
No, you're welcome. Yeah. So this is why, and this is actually, when you speak about humility as well, this is speaking to the piece around cultural attunement.
Yes.
Cultural attunement is the combination of cultural curiosity, cultural humility, and cultural empathy. And so by having cultural humility, empathy, and curiosity, that is us using power in between and power with, rather than power over. We can't be empathic, we can't be culturally empathic, humble, and curious, whilst at the same time trying to dominate somebody. They're incompatible. Yeah. Well, we cannot hold power over somebody at the same time trying to demonstrate humility or curiosity or empathy. Just does not. It's a power over is a different power hierarchy to cultural attunement, which is a power between, a power with somebody else, like the balancing of the scales. Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts or reflections? Well, we're all really speaking to, yeah, this is what it is to be anti-oppressive, as supervisors, as counsellors. Yeah. I'm curious then, because what we're going to do then is start to kind of shift into, specifically now that we've looked at anti-oppressive, what anti-oppressive is in and of itself as a power dynamic. We're going to say, right, well, how do we now do this in supervision? Any immediate thoughts in that? I'm just curious about any immediate reflections or thoughts about what this might mean now as supervisors, or any immediate feelings, or how does it feel at the thought of applying this to your supervision?
I feel like I'm looking forward to it. I'm like excited to kind of learn a little bit more. I also feel like it feels quite big in the sense where I guess it's like my own thing of like, oh my God, I need to do it all at once, rather than kind of like introducing it over like a period of time. But I guess that's what it's kind of bringing up in me a little bit. And I've also run group supervision, so I'm also curious as to how you almost have to manage that whilst also managing kind of like group dynamics and like the relationship between people, and like other concepts that can sometimes come in, like rescuing or like, you know, like that. Yeah, so I guess I'm just curious about all of it, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we'll be thinking about that definitely today. Yeah. Any other just immediate thoughts and then thinking about, right, we're going to be applying this to supervision, just kind of attuning to ourselves and perhaps how we're feeling. Emma and then Cheryl. Yeah.
I've been wanting to write about power and IFS for quite a while. And so this is all kind of helping all that bubbling stuff that's going on. And I'd like to write because that helps me think and practice. And so I'm also excited. And it is illuminating some of the relationships in which I struggle when there's something off about my system's relationship to oppression and their system's relationship to oppression somehow. So I guess I'm kind of feeling more hopeful about having a language to talk about our relationships with these concepts. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Yes. Cheryl.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how it's a specific application of kind of bringing in shadow side and the warts and all approach to supervision, and providing that safe space and kind of normalizing that anyone and everyone can have unconscious biases, and it can be uncomfortable work to be constantly kind of reflecting on these things. So I think sometimes supervisees want to kind of get it right and say the right thing and think the right thing and become their own thought police, and so yeah, that's what's uppermost in my mind at the moment.
I'll speak to that in a moment because something's popped into my head based on that, but thank you for sharing that, Cheryl. Yeah. Anybody else just kind of want to name kind of just where they're at with it in terms of thinking about applying this to supervision?
I think
will
it was
be
something that's not, oh, sorry, Maria.
Oh,
No, no,
both at
no.
the same time. Go on.
It's just a quick observation. I will feel more confident, Myra, after we're going through the model, to actually apply it in my practice. To them, I have seen the model in a BACP, the 9 eyes you're going to present. So yeah, I'll feel more confident there, and I'll have more answers then, I think.
Yes.
As in what, how, when,
yeah, we're building the model actually as we're
Yes.
speaking. Yes. So that by the time you get to the 9-eyed model, you'll be like, it just all slots into place. But yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Maria. Yes. Yeah. Emily.
Yeah, no, it was something that was triggered from what Cheryl was just saying, actually, and that use of the phrase safe space. It's something that I've been really sitting with since we started the workshop, and I've been reflecting on my use of that description in, you know, on my website or on a directory profile, and I've been really sitting here challenging myself about using that, and actually how it doesn't seem right to have used that. Like, actually the whole point is that acknowledgement that we're not existing in safe spaces. And I think, yeah, I've been reflecting on my own use of it and how I want to go back and revisit that and rethink about that.
Absolutely, yes. I'm going to quickly jot down 2 words because I will forget them by the time I speak to them. Okay, yes. So yeah, in connection then to absolutely what Emily and Cheryl, what you've both said is, so language is so important. Just by pivoting from working with to working within, we can see that the use of our language can fundamentally shift how we think about our work and how we do our work. And so in thinking specifically of this phrase then, safe space, I'm thinking back to Cheryl, you then talking about how supervisees kind of want to know, want to say the right thing, want to have the answers. And interestingly, the reason why I've kind of thinking about both of these 2 concepts simultaneously and why they're in my mind related to one another, this idea of safe, Emily talking about safe space, and Cheryl, you kind of talking about supervisees wanting to know the right answer. Both of these ideas for me speak to competency, and speak to a competency model that what am I doing? What am I thinking? What do I know? And so they both, for me, belong in the oppressive camp. Because when we want to know the right answer, and when we want to be sure that we are doing the right thing, and when we want to be sat in a known position, we are focused on our own level of competency, and we are immediately out of attunement and relationship with the person in front of us. And it puts us in a place of competency. And it's why, again, I absolutely do not agree with the term cultural competence, because it immediately places us and reinforces the idea that we can know, we can cognitively learn, have certain knowledge and skills about culture. And more broadly than that, anything to do with diversity and identity. So any training that you see that talks about cultural competency, I would really question, what is it that they are measuring that you are competent in? And how can you ensure that you are measuring up to that? Because who's setting the bar? And so I have a real problem with that phrase competency. And so that's why this feeds and reinforces, that's why I think particularly trainees or newly qualified counsellors or supervisors, why we can fall into this trap of needing to know, it is because we believe we have to be competent. And the moment we say that we need to be competent, we have lost our relationship and we have lost our humanity in the room. And we become performative. And performative to who? to the people that have trained us in competency, well, that you're never going to probably see them again. They're going to have no more involvement in your practice. So the idea that people can come along and train you in competency and then leave you to it, it's false accountability. Yeah. The reason why then competencies for me and safe space belong in the same category of oppressive, that camp of oppression, is because just like we have competencies that are about what we can do, how much do I know? Look at me, I'm all knowledgeable about culture, and look at the skills I've got, and look at what I cognitively know about something. It puts us in a position of assumptions and expectations on ourselves. And this is where the safe space concept comes in for me. We can never assume or expect that the space we offer is safe for anybody. And the idea that we can create a safe space is another fantasy. A space is felt as safe. A space is not created as safe. Rather, we create the environment, the relationship, the conditions, the rapport, the process for our clients and supervisees to then let us know if they feel safe or not in it. An anti-oppressive practice literally allows the space not only for it to be safe or not, but also the space to think about whether it's safe or not. The idea that we say that we create safe spaces, it's interesting because actually I do use that language in the book, ironically, but I think that's because the thinking's been adapted, enhanced since. But what I'm really speaking to, though, is that we cannot assume that we create safe spaces. Why? Because not everyone is going to experience us in our identity as safe. Let's go back to that system of oppression. Not everyone is going to look at me and go, Myra is a safe person. They cannot look at me and assume, and I cannot assume, that everybody's going to look at me and go, she's a counsellor, she is safe. She's a supervisor, she is safe. We cannot have that as our default. To have that as our default is to be oppressive, because we then don't allow the space, and we don't allow in the space the ability, the capacity for it to be thought about together, for it to be spoken and named. The only person that can tell me if spaces that I offer are safe or not is my clients and my supervisees. Because to some people, I am unsafe for them. I think that takes, I think, a level of honesty. It takes a level of recognizing that the world is full of systemic and structural inequality. The world is full of isms and prejudices and biases. That I'm going to be on the receiving end of some of that. Yeah. So again, this is what it means to move into this anti-oppressive position or space.
I think this is reminding me, like, even therapeutically, how even if you're in a trusting situation at one point, someone could say something that actually triggers you outside of a trusting space quite quickly.
Oh,
and it
yes.
and especially if you're working with kind of trauma clients, like there's something about like what you say can easily kind of take you out of a non-trustworthy space or not safe space or anything like that.
Absolutely.
It's not like a fixed position that you arrive at.
Yes. Yeah. It's fluid as the relationship evolves, as the relationship progresses, as we work through stuff in the process. It's moment by moment whether a client or supervisee feels safe or not. Transference alone immediately can shift from a client or a supervisee to feel safe to unsafe or unsafe to safe. In a blink of an eye, it can change in the room. So this idea that we offer safe spaces is a fantasy. Yeah. I think a few people wanted to come in, then I think Emily wanted to come in. Yeah. And
oh no, I was just going to say that I'm really grateful for you naming it, like, and having talked through that. I think it's something, I've got a lengthy to-do list, and looking at some of the wording that I've used on websites and profiles and things is one of them. And I think I haven't done it to this point because I haven't fully formulated in my head why it feels wrong and what I would want to make changes to, and what I would want that change to look like. And I think this discussion's really helping me to formulate that much more clearly in my head. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Yes. It's yes, we're moving from creating safe spaces to we're creating spaces for clients to feel safe in. Yeah. And that's also part of and actually just again shifting the phrasing shifts power, because rather than going I'm creating safe spaces, the power's with me to create a safe space. Shifting into I'm creating a space for a client or supervisee to feel safe in. Guess what? They now hold the power to determine whether this space is safe or not. I cannot hold power over them to insist that it's safe. I don't have that level. I don't have that type of power because I choose not to abuse my power in that way. But if I wasn't aware of it, I could quite easily abuse my clients and supervisees and insist and say that of course my spaces are safe. What that also will do, a little ripple effect of that will also be, if I take up a power over a oppressive position and say, of course my spaces are safe for everybody, what I don't allow for is for anybody to challenge that as well. And by them not being able to challenge, if they were to challenge, then the feeling of unsafety, person who feels unsafe in my oppressive spaces would then feel that them feeling unsafe was actually their problem and something wrong with them. Does that make sense to people? Yeah.
Yes.
If I insist that if I insist it's a safe space, any client or supervisee that's actually, oh my goodness, but I actually feel unsafe in this. What's wrong with me? I shouldn't be feeling this. I actually stop them from verbalizing it. I stop them from being able to share that with me or for us to work through it. Yeah. Cheryl, please.
I hope this doesn't sound defensive, but I wasn't saying that I claim to host spaces. I tried to cultivate that and negotiate it with my
Oh no, yeah. No, I didn't interpret that at all. I think it was picking up on you saying that thing of supervisees wanting to know and be right, and that is connected with safe spaces. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm mindful it's kind of a couple of minutes before the lunch break. I don't want to kind of jump into kind of thinking about the supervision model straight away, because obviously we're about to go for an hour's lunch. But what I want to kind of invite you to think about is thinking then now for the rest of the day, for the rest of the afternoon, we're going to specifically then, of course, then be focusing on supervision itself. Now that we've kind of covered what anti-oppressive practice is, or what the shift is from oppressive position to anti-oppressive position, we're going to be focusing then, of course, then on how do we offer that in supervision. What we're going to do when we come back after the break, the first thing I'm going to invite you, I'm going to put you into breakout rooms for you in smaller groups to think about this, but maybe again, in order to shift into anti-oppressive supervision, guess where our starting point is? We have to pivot from oppressive supervision. So what we're going to do when we come back, and maybe this is where you want to maybe digest this or percolate this over the lunch hour, is what might oppressive supervision then look like? Yeah. How might it show up in the relationship, in the process? Okay. So that's going to be our starting point after lunch. But I also want to give you an opportunity to kind of just start thinking about that based off the discussion we've just had and the morning session we've had. Okay. So thinking around, if we now know that we're moving from oppressive to anti-oppressive, if we now understand the ingredients of oppressive practice, what then might oppressive supervision, unfortunately, in brackets, look like? Okay. How might anti-oppressive supervision intentionally or unintentionally, consciously or unconsciously show up in supervision? Is everyone kind of clear? I mean, I'll have the question up on a slide after we come back from the lunch break, but just something to give yourselves to think about moving into the afternoon. Okay.
Myra,
Yeah, please. Yes, Emma.
Sorry,
Yes.
I know I missed a little chunk.
Yes.
I've got your book. Is there a model I might have missed that I can look up quickly, or?
It's the model in the book, the Working Within Diversity model, and I have it right in front of me. It's like Blue Peter. It's as if I've prepared one earlier. She says, trying to find it in the book. Oh, so I've gone too far into it. Page 28.
Thank you very much.
Model is on page 28 in the book.
Lovely.
Okay. So please go and enjoy your hour's break. Please make sure you get away from the screen, whatever you need to do to meet your needs in the next hour, and we'll be back at 2 o'clock. Okay. I will be around for the hour, so if people do need to check in with me at any point, please do feel free just to shout through my screen and I will hear you. Okay. And I'll see you back at 2 otherwise. Take care. Have a good break.